David Rodriguez had been missing for exactly 12 years when he walked into the Desert View Diner in Barstow, California, on a Tuesday morning in March. The waitress, Linda, almost dropped her coffee pot when she saw him. Not because she recognized him, she didn't, but because of the way he looked, thin, weathered, with clothes that seemed decades out of style, and eyes that held the kind of emptiness she'd only seen in war veterans who'd returned from places they couldn't talk about. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the diner mostly empty, except for a trucker reading a newspaper in the corner booth, and an elderly couple sharing pancakes by the window. The desert sun streamed through the glass, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum floor, but the man who'd just entered seemed to flinch away from the light as if it physically hurt him. His hair was longer than what was fashionable, streaked with premature grey that made him look older than his years, and his skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. Linda had worked at the Desert View for 15 years, serving everyone from lost tourists to long-haul drivers to the occasional Hollywood type passing through on their way to Vegas. She prided herself on being able to read people, to know within minutes whether someone wanted conversation or solitude, whether they were running toward something or away from it. But this man was different. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd forgotten how to navigate the ordinary world, pausing to study the digital menu board as if the glowing display was something he'd never encountered before. He ordered black coffee and scrambled eggs, his voice barely above a whisper, and paid with crumpled bills that looked like they'd been buried underground for years. The money itself was legitimate. She checked it carefully after years of dealing with counterfeit 20s, but it had an odd quality to it, as if it had aged in ways that normal currency didn't. When she brought him his order, she noticed his hands. They were scarred in a way that spoke of years of manual labor, with calluses and old burns that created a map of hardship across his palms and fingers. He ate methodically, pausing occasionally to look out the window at the parking lot, where 18-wheelers sat baking in the desert heat. Every few minutes, a car would drive past on the highway, and his eyes would track the movement with an intensity that made Linda uncomfortable. It was the kind of focused attention she associated with predators, but there was something vulnerable about it too, as if he was trying to remember what normal traffic patterns looked like. Before we continue with David's incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's dive deeper into what happened that day and the mystery that would soon captivate the entire nation. When the man finished eating, he left exactly $15 on the table, enough to cover the bill and a generous tip, and walked out without another word. Linda watched through the window as he stood in the parking lot for several minutes, turning slowly to orient himself with the sun's position before walking east along the frontage road that paralleled Interstate 40. There was something about his gait, the way he moved with purpose despite appearing lost, that stayed with her for the rest of her shift. It wasn't until that evening, when Linda's nephew Jeremy stopped by to pick up leftover pie for his night security job, that everything changed. Jeremy was studying criminal justice at Barstow Community College and had a part-time job monitoring missing persons databases for the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. As Linda described the strange customer from that morning, Jeremy pulled out his phone and began scrolling through recent alerts. "Wait," he said, stopping at a particular entry. "Describe his face again. Height, build, everything you can remember." The flyer Jeremy showed her had been updated just 2 weeks earlier, part of a routine refresh of long-term missing persons cases. It showed a 23-year-old man with bright eyes and a confident smile, last seen hiking alone in the San Bernardino Mountains in March 2012. David Rodriguez, a software engineer from Los Angeles, had told his roommate he was going on a solo camping trip to clear his head after a difficult breakup with his girlfriend of 3 years. His car, a blue 2009 Honda Civic, was found 3 days later in the parking area of a remote trailhead near Big Bear Lake. Keys still in the ignition, wallet and phone untouched on the dashboard. The initial search had been extensive and well coordinated. Search and rescue teams from 3 counties combed the mountains for weeks, using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, trained search dogs, and more than 200 volunteers who covered every trail and ravine within a 15-mile radius of where David's car was found. They discovered no trace of him, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not even the remnants of a campsite. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a family desperate for answers. Linda stared at the photograph on Jeremy's phone, her mind racing back through the details of her encounter with the man at table 12. The bone structure was right, the general height and build matched, but 12 years had transformed the confident young professional in the photo into someone who looked like he'd aged decades in the wilderness. The eyes were what convinced her. Despite everything else that had changed, those same dark brown eyes stared back at her from the screen. Jeremy called the sheriff's department immediately, speaking in rapid, excited bursts to the dispatcher, while Linda paced nervously around the empty diner. Within 30 minutes, Detective Maria Santos was sitting across from Linda, in the same booth where the mysterious man had eaten his breakfast, her notepad open, asking Linda to describe every detail she could remember about their interaction. Detective Santos had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, since joining the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, fresh out of the police academy. She'd learned early in her career to manage her expectations when it came to long-term disappearances. Most people who vanished and eventually returned had stories that were more mundane than mysterious. Mental health crises that led to voluntary disappearance, family disputes that drove people to start new lives under assumed names, financial troubles that made disappearing seem like the only option. But something about the David Rodriguez case had always bothered her, even though she hadn't worked the original investigation. He was quiet, Linda said, wrapping her fingers around a cold cup of coffee that had been sitting untouched for 20 minutes. Polite, but distant, like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. And his hands, I noticed his hands when he paid. They were scarred, really scarred, like he'd been doing hard manual labor for years. But it wasn't just work scars, you know. There were burns, and what looked like old cuts that hadn't healed properly. Santos took detailed notes, asking follow-up questions about David's clothing, his demeanor, the way he'd interacted with the modern technology in the diner. Linda's description painted a picture of someone who seemed genuinely surprised by things like the digital menu board and the credit card reader, as if these everyday technologies were unfamiliar to him. "Did he seem afraid?" Santos asked. Linda considered the question carefully. Not afraid, exactly, more like cautious, like he was waiting for something bad to happen but trying not to show it. He kept looking at the exits, and every time a car drove past outside, he'd track it with his eyes until it was out of sight. The conversation continued for another hour, with Santos gathering every possible detail about David's appearance and behavior. When she finally left the diner, she had a clear picture of a man who appeared to be David Rodriguez, but had been fundamentally changed by whatever had happened to him during the 12 years he'd been missing. Her next step was to contact the original investigating officers and review the case file she'd only glanced at years earlier. The case file made for sobering reading. David Rodriguez had been a stable, well-adjusted young man with no history of mental illness, substance abuse, or financial problems. His disappearance had occurred during a difficult period in his personal life, but nothing that seemed severe enough to trigger a voluntary disappearance. The search efforts had been thorough and professional, covering not just the immediate area where his car was found, but expanding outward in concentric circles over the course of several weeks. What caught Santos's attention, however, was a detail that had been noted but not fully investigated at the time. David Rodriguez was the fourth person to disappear from remote areas of the San Bernardino mountains over a 10-year period. The other three cases, a retired teacher named Patricia Wynn, a college student named James Park, and a young couple on their honeymoon, had never been connected because they occurred in different jurisdictions and were spread out over several years. Santos spent the rest of the evening making phone calls to detectives in neighboring counties, gathering information about the other disappearances. A pattern began to emerge that was both subtle and disturbing. All of the missing persons had been experienced hikers who knew the mountains well. All had disappeared during solo trips or when temporarily separated from their companions. And in each case, their vehicles had been found with no signs of struggle or foul play, but with personal items left behind that suggested they had intended to return. The next morning, Santos drove to the address listed on David's old missing person report. The apartment building in West Hollywood was a modest two-story complex that housed mainly young professionals and college students. The area had gentrified significantly over the past 12 years, with new restaurants and coffee shops replacing the laundromats and check-cashing stores that Linda remembered from her earlier visits to the neighborhood. David's former roommate, Kevin Liu, had moved to Portland years earlier to take a job with a tech startup, but Santos was able to reach him by phone that afternoon. Kevin's reaction to the news that David might still be alive was a mixture of relief, confusion, and something that sounded almost like fear. "David!" Kevin's voice cracked through the static of the long-distance connection. "Are you sure it's him? I mean, are you absolutely sure? Because if it is, God, I can't believe it's been 12 years. Santos explained what they knew so far, which admittedly wasn't much beyond Linda's eyewitness account and Jeremy's identification of the missing person flyer. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, and Santos could hear the sound of traffic in the background, suggesting he was taking the call while walking somewhere in Portland. "I need to tell you something about the day he left," Kevin said finally. "David wasn't just dealing with a breakup. He'd been acting strange for weeks before he disappeared. Paranoid almost. He kept saying someone was following him, watching his apartment. He'd installed these elaborate locks on our door and started varying his route to work every day. This was information that hadn't appeared in any of the original police reports, and Santos felt a familiar chill that came with discovering a significant detail that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. She pressed Kevin for more specifics about David's behavior in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. "He thought his phone was being tapped," Kevin continued. "He'd stopped using his credit cards and was paying for everything in cash. I thought it was just stress from work and the girlfriend situation, but now, God, what if I was wrong? What if someone really was after him?" The revelation changed the entire complexion of the case. If David had disappeared because he was being pursued by someone, then his reappearance 12 years later raised questions about where he'd been and why he was surfacing now. Santos immediately requested access to David's old case file and spent the evening reading through witness statements, search reports, and evidence logs she'd never seen before. Buried in the paperwork was the detail about the other missing hikers, along with a note from the original detective suggesting that the disappearances might be connected. But the investigation had stalled due to jurisdictional issues and lack of concrete evidence linking the cases. Reading through the files 12 years later, with the benefit of hindsight and Kevin's new information about David's paranoid behavior, Santos began to see patterns that the original investigators had missed. The timing of the disappearances followed a rough schedule, occurring approximately every 2 to 3 years. The locations, while spread across different mountain ranges, were all within a 100-mile radius of each other and shared similar characteristics: remote trailheads with limited cell phone coverage and infrequent ranger patrols. Most significantly, all of the missing persons had been people with technical skills or specialized knowledge that could be valuable to certain types of organizations. David Rodriguez was a software engineer specializing in network security. Patricia Wynn had been a retired Army communications specialist who taught electronics at a community college. James Park was studying computer science with a focus on cryptography. The honeymooning couple, Tom and Lisa Chen, were both graduate students in environmental engineering who had been researching water management systems for their thesis projects. Santos realized she was looking at something much more complex than a series of random disappearances. If her theory was correct, these people had been specifically targeted and taken for their expertise. But taken by whom and for what purpose? And why was David Rodriguez, after 12 years, suddenly free to return to the world? Meanwhile, across town, the man everyone hoped was David Rodriguez was sitting in a motel room he'd paid for with cash, staring at a television that seemed impossibly thin and bright compared to what he remembered from 2012. The news was talking about something called social media, about phones that could take pictures and connect to the internet, about political developments and cultural changes that made him feel like he'd awakened in a different world entirely. The remote control felt foreign in his hands, the buttons responding to touches that seemed to require less pressure than he remembered. Even the channels were different, networks he'd never heard of, programming that followed formats he didn't recognize. But it was the commercials that disturbed him most. The products being advertised, the technology being taken for granted, the casual references to apps and streaming services and digital currencies that hadn't existed when he'd left for his hiking trip in 2012. He'd been walking for 3 days before he reached Barstow, though he couldn't entirely remember where he'd started walking from. His last clear memory before the diner was of stumbling through desert scrub in the pre-dawn darkness, following what might have been an old mining road, or might have been just a game trail worn by wild animals. Before that, his memories became increasingly fragmented and unreliable, but he did remember the beginning. Setting up his tent near a stream in the San Bernardino mountains, the sound of water running over stones lulling him to sleep on what he'd thought would be the first night of a peaceful solo camping trip. He remembered waking up to the sound of footsteps outside his tent, the zip of the door opening, and then hands grabbing him before he could fully comprehend what was happening. Everything after that was a kaleidoscope of images and sensations that didn't quite form coherent memories. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that never turned off, the taste of canned food and the constant hum of ventilation systems, voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, and always, the sense that he was being watched and evaluated for purposes he couldn't understand. But the darkness wasn't complete, and he hadn't been alone. There had been others with him, he was certain of that much. Other people who'd been taken from trails and campsites, from parking areas and scenic overlooks throughout the western United States. They'd talked, whispered really, during the brief periods when their captors weren't monitoring them closely. There had been Patricia, a woman in her 50s who'd been hiking with her dog when she disappeared from a trail near Lake Arrowhead. She'd been there longer than anyone, taken sometime in the early 2000s, and she'd developed theories about why they'd all been chosen. There was James, barely out of his teens, who'd been on a fishing trip with his father when something had separated them during the night. And Tom and Lisa, the newlyweds who'd been taken together and who provided emotional support for the others during the darkest periods of their captivity. David pulled out a piece of paper he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since his escape, a hand-drawn map that Patricia had sketched during one of their whispered conversations. It showed locations throughout California, Nevada, and Arizona where people had vanished over the past 2 decades, places that seemed random at first glance but followed a pattern she'd been trying to decode for years. The paper was water-stained and fragile, covered in tiny handwriting that detailed dates, names, and locations Patricia had compiled from conversations with other captives and observations she'd made during the rare times they were moved between facilities. According to her research, disappearances in remote areas of the Southwest had been happening for much longer than law enforcement realized, but always in small numbers and always spread out enough geographically and temporally that no one had connected them into a larger pattern. Patricia believed they were being taken for their technical knowledge and specialized skills, forced to work on projects they were never allowed to fully understand. But she'd also suspected there was something more systematic at work, something that required the kind of long-term planning and resource coordination that suggested involvement by organized criminal networks or possibly even foreign intelligence services. David folded the map carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to go to the police or disappear again. Part of him wanted to run, to find somewhere safe and quiet where he could try to process the lost years and figure out how to function in a world that had moved on without him. But Patricia's map weighed heavy in his pocket, along with the knowledge that others might still be out there, still trapped in the facilities and underground complexes where he'd spent 12 years of his life. The investigation into David's reappearance moved quickly once Detective Santos brought in federal agents. The FBI had been tracking unusual disappearance patterns in remote areas for years as part of a broader initiative to identify potential domestic terrorism threats and foreign intelligence operations. But they'd never had a living witness to interview before. Agent Rebecca Cross, a specialist in organized abduction cases with 15 years of experience in counterintelligence, arrived from the San Francisco field office within 48 hours of Linda's phone call to the sheriff's department. Cross had built her career on cases that existed at the intersection of criminal activity and national security concerns. She'd worked kidnapping cases involving foreign nationals, investigated human trafficking networks that targeted people with specific skills or security clearances, and spent 3 years embedded with a joint task force that focused on economic espionage. The David Rodriguez case, based on the preliminary information Santos had gathered, had all the hallmarks of something that fell within her area of expertise. The interview took place in a secure room at the Los Angeles FBI field office, with David sitting across from Agent Cross and Detective Santos, a court stenographer recording every word, and 2 additional agents observing from behind one-way glass. David had been located at the Barstow Motel after a systematic canvass of local accommodations, and he had agreed to speak with federal investigators after being assured that he was not considered a suspect in any crime. Cross had reviewed David's original missing person case file, along with the files for the other disappearances Santos had identified, and she had developed a preliminary theory about what might have happened to him. But she was prepared for his story to challenge her assumptions, and she began the interview with open-ended questions designed to let David tell his account in his own words. "I remember being grabbed from behind while I was brushing my teeth by the stream," David said, his voice steady but quiet, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow alert his former captors to his location. "There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. They used something, a cloth or a mask, that made me lose consciousness almost immediately. Some kind of chemical, I think, because I remember a sweet smell before everything went dark." When he woke up, David found himself in what appeared to be an old mining facility that had been extensively modified and converted into a prison complex. The space was partially underground, with a network of tunnels connecting different areas that served various functions. There were dormitory-style sleeping quarters, workshops where prisoners were forced to perform manual labor, common areas for meals and limited recreation, and administrative sections where their captors maintained offices and living spaces. The lighting never changed, David continued. It was always these harsh fluorescent bulbs that made it impossible to tell what time it was, or even whether it was day or night outside. They kept us on a strict schedule. Wake up at what they told us was 6 in the morning, work for 12 hours with breaks for meals, then back to the dormitories. 7 days a week, no exceptions. He described a population of approximately 30 to 40 people being held in the facility during his time there, with the numbers fluctuating as new prisoners arrived and others disappeared for reasons that were never explained. The captives ranged in age, from teenagers to elderly individuals, but they all shared certain characteristics. They had been taken from remote locations throughout the western United States, and they all possessed technical skills or specialized knowledge that their captors found valuable. They made us work on manufacturing projects, David said, small electronic components that we assembled by hand using equipment they'd set up in converted mine shafts. Circuit boards, transmitters, what looked like surveillance devices. We worked in teams, but no team was allowed to see the complete assembly process, so none of us knew exactly what we were building. Agent Cross took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the layout of the facility, the number of guards, the languages they spoke, and any distinguishing features or identifying information David could remember. The story he told was consistent and detailed, showing none of the hesitation or contradiction that typically marked false testimonies or recovered memory narratives. The people running the operation maintained strict security protocols and never revealed their identities or affiliations to the prisoners. They wore masks during most interactions, communicated with each other in what sounded like multiple foreign languages, and enforced discipline through a combination of isolation punishment and the implicit threat that uncooperative prisoners might simply disappear permanently. But they weren't unnecessarily cruel, David added. We were fed regularly, given basic medical care when needed, allowed to shower and maintain basic hygiene. It was more like we were valuable resources that needed to be kept functional rather than prisoners being punished for something. Cross found this detail particularly interesting, as it suggested a level of organization and long-term planning that was consistent with state-sponsored operations rather than typical criminal enterprises. Criminal organizations that engaged in kidnapping and forced labor usually showed less concern for the long-term health and welfare of their victims. "How did you escape?" Santos asked, leaning forward slightly in her chair. David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the table as he stared at a spot on the wall behind Cross's head. This was clearly the part of his story that he found most difficult to discuss, and Cross made a note to circle back to it with more specific questions later in the interview. "There was an explosion," David said finally, "some kind of accident in one of the manufacturing areas. The power went out and the security systems failed. In the confusion, several of us managed to get away from our workstations and find our way to parts of the facility we'd never been allowed to access before." He described running through tunnels he'd never seen, following air currents and the faint sound of wind that suggested a path to the surface. Other escapees had scattered in different directions, and David didn't know whether any of them had successfully gotten away. When he finally found an exit, he emerged into desert terrain that he didn't recognize, with no landmarks or roads visible in any direction. "I walked for days before I reached the highway," David said. "I had no food, no water after the first day. I was starting to think I was going to die out there when I finally saw the interstate and managed to flag down a trucker who gave me a ride to Barstow. Ndun." The FBI immediately launched a massive investigation based on David's account, using his descriptions of the facility and the surrounding terrain to narrow down possible locations for the underground complex. Satellite imagery specialists began searching for areas that matched his recollections, remote locations with vehicle access, signs of recent construction or mining activity, and the kind of infrastructure that could support a large-scale operation while remaining hidden from casual observation. Meanwhile, missing persons databases were cross-referenced with David's timeline and the names he remembered from his captivity. The results were both encouraging and disturbing. Patricia Wynn, the 54-year-old teacher from Phoenix, had disappeared while hiking near Lake Arrowhead in 2018, exactly as David had described. James Park, a college student from San Diego, had vanished during a camping trip with his father in Joshua Tree National Park in 2019. Both cases matched David's descriptions perfectly, confirming that his account was accurate and that other people were likely still being held in similar facilities. But the investigation also revealed gaps and inconsistencies that troubled Agent Cross. David's description of the explosion that enabled his escape didn't align with the careful security measures he described throughout the rest of his captivity. An operation sophisticated enough to maintain an underground prison for decades would have backup power systems and redundant security protocols that wouldn't be defeated by a single industrial accident. Cross shared her concerns with the task force that had been assembled to investigate the case, which included specialists from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and representatives from several other agencies with relevant expertise. The consensus was that David's escape had likely been facilitated by his captors as part of a larger plan, possibly to shut down the operation and relocate to a different facility. This theory gained credibility when financial investigators discovered that the shell companies associated with various mining operations in the region had begun liquidating their assets and transferring funds to offshore accounts starting approximately 2 weeks before David appeared in Barstow. It seemed increasingly likely that his reappearance had been timed to coincide with the operation's planned shutdown, raising questions about why his captors had chosen to release him and what they expected him to do with his freedom. The breakthrough in identifying the facility's location came when analysts discovered an abandoned copper mine in the Mojave Desert that had been purchased by a shell company registered in Delaware in 2008. Recent satellite images showed unexplained vehicle traffic and what appeared to be new construction around the old mine shafts, including the installation of solar panels and communication equipment that didn't match the infrastructure typically associated with legitimate mining operations. Cross's team also identified a pattern of real estate transactions and equipment purchases that suggested the same organization had been establishing similar facilities in remote areas throughout Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico over the past 15 years. The scope of the operation was far larger than anyone had initially suspected, involving millions of dollars in investment and coordination across multiple states. Within 72 hours of identifying the Mojave Desert location, a joint FBI-ATF tactical team was preparing for a coordinated raid on what they now believed was an active criminal enterprise engaged in kidnapping, forced labor, and possibly espionage activities. David insisted on being present during the operation, despite strong objections from Agent Cross and her supervisors who were concerned about his safety and the possibility that his presence might compromise the raid. In the end, his intimate knowledge of the facility's layout proved invaluable for planning the tactical approach and identifying potential escape routes that the suspects might use to evade capture. He rode in one of the support vehicles, wearing a bulletproof vest and staying well back from the entry points as federal agents moved into position around the mine complex in the pre-dawn darkness. The raid lasted 4 hours and unfolded exactly as David had predicted. The facility was a maze of tunnels and converted underground spaces where a total of 18 people, ranging in age from 17 to 63, were being held in conditions that matched David's description perfectly. The prisoners were weak and disoriented after years of captivity, but they were alive and coherent enough to provide initial statements confirming David's account of the operation. 7 suspects were arrested during the raid, including the operation's apparent leader, a former military contractor named Robert Vance, who had been using kidnapped labor to fulfill manufacturing contracts with what investigators later determined were foreign intelligence services. The electronic devices being assembled in the underground workshops were components for sophisticated surveillance equipment that was being exported to countries under US sanctions. The victims, after receiving immediate medical attention, were transported to secure facilities where they could be debriefed and begin the process of reintegrating into a world that had changed significantly during their years of captivity. Many of them, like David, had been missing for over a decade and would need extensive support to adjust to technological and social changes they had missed. But the successful rescue operation, while providing closure for multiple families and disrupting a significant criminal enterprise, also raised new questions that troubled Agent Cross and her colleagues. David's account of the explosion that allowed his escape still didn't match the physical evidence found at the site during the raid. There was no sign of recent damage to the manufacturing areas, no indication that any kind of accident had occurred in the weeks or months before the facility was abandoned. When pressed during follow-up interviews, David's memory of his escape remained frustratingly vague, with details that shifted slightly each time he recounted the events. This inconsistency, combined with the evidence that his captors had been planning to shut down the operation around the same time he appeared in Barstow, suggested that his release had been deliberate rather than accidental. Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and memory who had extensive experience working with victims of organized crime and human trafficking, was brought in to evaluate David and the other survivors. Her psychological assessments revealed that all of the victims showed signs of systematic conditioning designed to suppress certain memories while preserving others, a technique that was consistent with sophisticated brainwashing methods developed by intelligence agencies during the Cold War. It's possible that David's escape wasn't as spontaneous as he remembers, Dr. Kim explained to Agent Cross during a confidential briefing. His captors may have deliberately released him as part of their shutdown procedure, perhaps because they needed someone to lead law enforcement to the facility after they had completed their evacuation. The memory of an explosion could have been implanted using psychological manipulation techniques to give him a believable explanation for how he got away. This theory gained additional support when investigators discovered that the Mojave Desert facility had been thoroughly cleaned and stripped of equipment before the raid, despite David's insistence that he had escaped only days earlier. Security cameras showed that the complex had been abandoned for at least 2 weeks, with systematic removal of computers, manufacturing equipment, and any other evidence that might have revealed the scope or purpose of the operation. The implications of these findings were disturbing. If David had been programmed to lead authorities to an empty facility while the real operation relocated to a new location, then the raid had been largely symbolic rather than substantive. The rescued prisoners were genuine victims who had been left behind, but the core leadership and infrastructure of the organization had escaped to continue their activities elsewhere. Agent Cross visited David at the secure medical facility, where he was undergoing psychological evaluation and debriefing, bringing with her a stack of photographs taken during the mine raid and detailed questions about inconsistencies in his account. As he looked through the images of the tunnels and rooms where he claimed to have spent 12 years of his life, his hands began to shake in a way that suggested he was genuinely disturbed by what he was seeing. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the facility's air conditioning system. "Something I couldn't remember before, but seeing these pictures, it's coming back to me now, and I think you need to know about it." David described a separate section of the facility that had been kept isolated from the main prison complex, accessible only through a heavily secured checkpoint that required multiple forms of identification and authorization. He had only seen this area once, during what his captors had described as a medical examination, but the brief glimpse had revealed something that changed his understanding of the entire operation. "They weren't just using us for manufacturing," he said, his voice gaining strength as the suppressed memories became clearer. "There was a whole other program running parallel to the forced labor. They were taking some of the prisoners, the ones with the most valuable skills or the right psychological profiles, and putting them through intensive training programs. Mom, he described what appeared to be a sophisticated facility designed for behavioral modification and skills training, with classrooms, simulation equipment, and living quarters that were significantly more comfortable than the prison dormitories where most captives were housed. The people in this program weren't forced to work in the manufacturing areas. Instead, they spent their time learning languages, studying technical manuals, practicing social interactions, and undergoing what could only be described as preparation for infiltration missions. They were teaching them to blend in, David said, his memories becoming more detailed as he continued speaking, how to adopt new identities, how to establish cover stories, how to gain access to sensitive facilities or information. It was like they were training sleeper agents, people who could be inserted into normal society and activated when needed. The implications of David's recovered memories sent shockwaves through the federal task force investigating the case. If the mining operation had been a cover for training foreign agents or domestic terrorists, then the national security implications were enormous. More disturbing was the possibility that other facilities like it might still be operating throughout the country, and that some of the people who had escaped or been rescued over the years might not be victims at all, but rather trained operatives who had been inserted into American society for purposes that remained unclear. A joint intelligence assessment was immediately initiated, involving not just the FBI, but also the CIA, NSA, and Department of Defense agencies responsible for counterintelligence operations. Missing persons databases were analyzed using new criteria, looking for patterns that might indicate systematic recruitment of people with valuable skills or access to sensitive information. Background investigations were launched on individuals who had returned from unexplained disappearances, focusing particularly on those who had subsequently obtained positions with government agencies, defense contractors, or critical infrastructure companies. The investigation expanded to include international cooperation with allied intelligence services who provided information about similar operations they had identified in other countries. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated long-term program designed to infiltrate Western societies with trained operatives who could remain dormant for years before being activated for specific missions. But as the investigation grew in scope and complexity, David Rodriguez himself became increasingly isolated and withdrawn from the process. The constant interviews, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations took a toll on his mental health, as did the growing realization that his ordeal might be part of something much larger and more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. The media attention surrounding his case had been intense from the beginning, but it became overwhelming as details about the underground facility and the broader investigation began to leak to news outlets. David found himself portrayed alternately as a heroic survivor, a potential security threat, and a victim of government conspiracy theories, depending on which news source was covering his story. 6 months after his reappearance in the Barstow Diner, David Rodriguez made a decision that surprised everyone who had been working with him throughout the investigation and recovery process. He requested to be relocated through the Federal Witness Protection Program, not because he feared retaliation from his former captors, but because he wanted to disappear again, this time on his own terms and with his own identity intact. "I've been gone for 12 years, he told Agent Cross during their final official meeting, which took place in the same secure conference room where she had first interviewed him about his experiences. "The world moved on without me. My family and friends assumed I was dead, and I'm not sure I belong in this reality anymore. Maybe some people are meant to stay lost." Cross understood his reasoning, even as she regretted losing access to what might be their most valuable source of information about an ongoing national security threat. David's psychological evaluations had shown that while he was mentally stable and not suffering from any major psychiatric disorders, he was struggling with severe adjustment difficulties that were unlikely to improve as long as he remained connected to the investigation and the media attention it generated. The FBI granted his request for relocation, and David Rodriguez vanished once again into the vast anonymity of American society, this time with a carefully constructed new identity and background that would allow him to start over somewhere far from the desert where his nightmare had begun, and the media scrutiny that had followed his return. But his story continued to resonate within the intelligence community, inspiring new investigations into missing persons cases and raising fundamental questions about how many other survivors might be out there, carrying secrets too dangerous or complex to fully comprehend. The case of the Mojave mining operation was eventually classified at the highest levels of government, its details known only to a small group of federal agents, intelligence analysts, and senior officials who needed the information to protect national security interests. But for those who worked on it, David Rodriguez's story served as a stark reminder that in the vast, empty spaces of the American West, the line between disappeared and returned, between victim and operative, between truth and carefully constructed deception, is sometimes thinner and more permeable than anyone in law enforcement wants to believe. Agent Cross kept a copy of Patricia Wynn's hand-drawn map in her personal case files, studying the patterns of disappearances it documented and cross-referencing them with new missing persons reports that came across her desk. In the years that followed David's second disappearance, she would investigate dozens of similar cases, always wondering if the next missing person who walked out of the wilderness after years of unexplained absence would be another genuine victim like David Rodriguez or something else entirely, a trained operative whose return was part of a larger plan that she was only beginning to understand. The truth, as Cross learned through painful experience, was that some mysteries are solved not by finding definitive answers, but by discovering that the questions themselves were more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. David Rodriguez had returned from 12 years of darkness in the underground tunnels of the Mojave Desert, but the shadows he brought with him, the knowledge of systematic kidnapping operations, the possibility of sleeper agents trained and inserted into American society, the realization that disappearance and return could be weapons in an undeclared intelligence war, would continue to influence missing persons investigations, national security assessments, and the nightmares of federal agents. For decades to come,